Charles asked that I address how nature and ecology shaped settlement and development, culture, and the economy of North Carolina. And so I'm going to attempt to describe this in 4 time frames. But first, how many of you are not from North Carolina? Raise your hands. Wow, awesome. Well, welcome to the Piedmont. So the Piedmont literally means the foot of the mountain. And the Piedmont region extends from New York to Alabama. It's a geographic region. And it's really defined and characterized by gently rolling landscapes, ranging in elevation from 300 to 400 feet on the eastern side to more than 1,000 feet on the western side. But here's an important point. It's also defined by these wide, shallow, rocky bottom rivers situated within broad floodplains, and at one time, thick deciduous and pine forests. As noted ecologist and botanist B.W. Wells stated, in regard to the thick forest cover that used to stretch across North Carolina, one could travel for days without a good view of the sun, and at night the constellations could seldom be seen because of the interfering canopy. That must have been quite a state to travel through. We're also located in the temperate deciduous forest biome of the world, which is noted for being the only region of the world with fall color. One thing that we all enjoy in North Carolina is 4 distinct seasons, and we celebrate them all equally. So Charles asked that I step back prior to Europeans' arrival and describe what North Carolina was like. And it was really a bountiful landscape that supported hunter-gatherers and then eventually transitioning into Native American farmers. Geology is a critical aspect of our state and our landscape. Essentially, ecology, the foundation of ecology, begins with geology and the soils. I refer to the Piedmont as sort of this mashup zone. It's a product of 2 colliding continents that created the 3 distinct biomes of North Carolina: the North Carolina Blue Ridge Mountains to the west, the Piedmont Plateau in the center, and the coastal plain to the east. The climate of the Piedmont is defined as humid subtropical, and the watersheds of North Carolina extend from the northwest to the southeast across the state, and this is really critical to our climate and our ecology as it determines rainfall, air quality, and monthly temperature range. We are blessed in North Carolina to live in one of the most biologically diverse regions of the world, where thousands of species of plants and animals have coexisted for thousands of years. It's very disappointing to me that we have not done a better job of being good stewards of this resource, and I think you saw that reflected in both Dick Bell and Lewis Clark's testimonies. North Carolina is home to 4,000 native plants, 700 of which are considered rare. We border the subtropic temperate and boreal habitat and are therefore blessed to have hundreds of species of native animals. Native Americans roamed across this landscape for 10,000 years prior to European arrival, and they were divided into several major tribes, including the Algonquin, the Cherokee, the Catawba, the Tuscarora. Hundreds of years prior to European arrival, Native Americans began to build settlements and farm the rich soils found across the region. Their agricultural knowledge was critical to the survival of European settlers, as the First Nations people educated and trained Europeans on their farming techniques. Unfortunately for Native Americans, their reward was to get evicted from their homeland. North Carolina was one of the last of the original 13 colonies to be settled by Europeans. This was a very difficult place to get to. The question is, how do you get from here into that landscape? It was essentially the undiscovered country between 2 deepwater ports, Jamestown to the north and Charlestown to the south, and the Atlantic Ocean that lay in between is affectionately known as the graveyard of the Atlantic. So it wasn't kind to seafaring vessels. The most accessible port into North Carolina was the Cape Fear River, which was really a dangerous place at the very beginning of European settlement to get into. And there were several failed attempts to establish settlements along the Cape Fear. The Moore brothers, Roger, George, and Maurice, built the town of Brunswick at the mouth of the river and enticed fellow Europeans to establish plantations along the river beginning in the 1720s. So those dots and names are all the plantations along the Cape Fear River system. Now, during this time, there were virtually no roads in North Carolina, nothing that we would regard as being passable. They were Native American trading paths, but the rivers were the primary travel corridors, and they influenced the way that North Carolina was developed. The vast majority of travel and the movement of agricultural products, especially into the port of Wilmington, which was established after Brunswick, were transported by river. So that's the early time frame. In the second time frame, I want to focus on movement into the deeper part of the state. And what's really important about this is the foundation of North Carolina's economy, which was born essentially among the longleaf pine ecosystem. And this was a very important ecosystem. It was once one of the most dominant ecosystems in North America. The longleaf pine extended across 90 million acres, covering much of the southeastern United States. It took a little more than 200 years for Europeans and Americans to harvest this longleaf pine forest to virtual extinction. As North Carolinians cleared the longleaf pine, we began to dramatically change the ecology in the native ecosystem. Extracting the raw pine resin from longleaf pine produced tar, pitch, and turpentine and created a very profitable industry for North Carolina. Turpentine stills, like the one pictured here, were found across North Carolina. They were exceptionally dangerous places to work. This is essentially the oil economy of its day, and they were often tended to by African slaves. The naval stores, as they were called, generated products primarily consumed by the British Navy. And North Carolina boasted one of the largest naval stores in the world. In fact, the British were able to cancel their contracts with the Norwegian area because of North Carolina's newfound wealth in naval stores. North Carolina derives its nickname, the Tar Heel State, essentially from the harvesting of the longleaf pine. Now, there's tons of stories about where this nickname came from, and I'm not going to get into that. But suffice it to say, it really was tied to the ecology of the state. Another critically important geologic feature of North Carolina is the fall line, which is that red line right there, and it separates the Piedmont from the coastal plain. It can be really seen here in this cross-section, the Carolina Slate Belt, but it's more seen physically if you travel along the rivers and streams where water pours over the rocky shelf. The fall line influenced the type of industry that developed here in the Piedmont as water power mills sprung up across the region, and at one time in Wake County alone, there were more than 70 water-powered mills. The one remaining, Yates Mill. And these mills essentially where the timber that was harvested was turned into lumber, and a variety of food products were made for human consumption. But I think more importantly, the fall line influenced how North Carolina was settled and developed. Basically, east of the fall line, you can see all the blue stars. Those are river cities. And then west of the fall line, these are basically non-river cities. I mean, there was a couple of things that happened. One, you had to get out of the boat to portage up over the fall line. Once you were out of the boat, you didn't put the boat back in because the river system had really changed. It was rocky bottom. It was difficult to navigate. So people began developing a different type of town and community. Now, Charles has given you sort of the background on Raleigh from its cultural planned perspective. Let me talk a little bit about the ecological perspective. The colonial capital city of North Carolina was New Bern, which was located on the coast and in a low-lying area. New Bern was almost uninhabitable in the summer, and there was real problems with mosquitoes and malaria. So when the General Assembly began looking for a spot to locate the capital city, they wanted high ground. They wanted something up out of the rivers. And also there was a history of flooding in eastern North Carolina of communities. So the plan for Raleigh is really high as they could possibly get. And you can see all the rivers that emanate and go away from the high point. And so Crispin's plan, which Charles talked about, really is laid out on that high point in that classic sort of government complex way. But likewise, the University of North Carolina is another planned community and planned city, the town of Chapel Hill. And when they were riding on horseback, looking for a place to plop down the university, they came across this area which they described as, the wild beauty of the hilltop forest. The seat of the university is on the summit of a very high ridge, so greatly elevated above the neighboring county as to furnish an extensive and beautiful landscape composed of the height and the vicinity of the Eno, Little, and Flat rivers. There's always been some questions about why the university and the capital city were developed not in the same location. At that time, the General Assembly recognized the need to separate politics from higher education. So the two institutions were deliberately located a day's horseback ride from each other. The other city in the triangle that's also very prominent and is developed much later is Durham. But Durham is also on a ridgeline, and it's the mercantile town. It was developed for commerce. It was the Durham station that was, after the Civil War, developed into the commerce center that it is today. Now, I want to pause and reflect a little bit to remember that North Carolina's economic growth and success was born on the bodies and the backs of enslaved African Americans. The work of harvesting the bounty of North Carolina's ecosystem was accomplished by enslaved people. If you just simply run the birth and death numbers for white Europeans, there's simply no way there were enough people to harvest the bounty. It was really the African Americans who accomplished that. Southern Europeans sold a myth of an aristocracy, which in fact was based on a set of falsehoods that did not properly or accurately account for the contributions that enslaved black men, women, and children made to North Carolina's economic growth. These myths were first exposed by a young man named Frederick Law Umstead, who 5 years before becoming superintendent of Central Park, traveled on horseback throughout the South, writing news articles for the New York Daily Times under the pseudonym Yeoman. The Times editor wanted Umstead to provide, and I quote, an accurate, complete, and dispassionate statement of facts concerning the industrial, social, educational, religious, and general interests of the southern United States. Umstead's first tome, published in 1852, A Journey Through the Seaboard Slave States, with remarks on their economy, was one of the first to describe life in the South. One of Umstead's first stops was in the emerging city of Raleigh, where, by the way, he noted that pigs were in a pen on the Capitol grounds. He thought that was very odd. Umstead later published The Cotton Kingdom, and his writings remain to this day one of the most accurate and vivid descriptions of the South as a region shaped by slavery. Umstead's writing helped demolish the romantic British notion of the Southern aristocrat as in essence a ruthless, profiteering slave owner. So there's no question the Civil War destroyed both the myth and the false economy of the South and its culture of slavery. But North Carolinians turned their attention once again to the land and its ecology during a Reconstruction period that lasted for quite a long time. The red clay soil of the Piedmont and the rich alluvial soil of the coastal plain proved the perfect habitat and climate for the growing a robust production of tobacco as one of the most important economic crops of this period. During the final stages of the Civil War, Union soldiers discovered the sweeter and milder tasting Bull Durham tobacco, which came from the brightleaf plant, which ironically was the accidental discovery of a slave named Stephen in Caswell County, North Carolina, and which became one of several types of tobacco to grow in North Carolina. Now, slavery evolved and was replaced with Jim Crow-era segregation and institution of sharecropping and tenant farming. It was a society that was separate and not equal, totally segregated. The tobacco industry gave rise to a network of railroads that stretched across the state and were laid out to deliver harvested tobacco from the eastern North Carolina areas to factories and processing plants in Durham, Winston-Salem, and other Piedmont communities. This was one of the most important ways in which the ecology of the state helped to shape town development and transportation patterns. One such railway was the New Hope Valley Railway, which extended into downtown Durham in the American Tobacco Campus, which you can ride tomorrow if you want to join us on the American Tobacco Trail. Now, James Buchanan Duke didn't invent tobacco, and he really wasn't even a part of the first wave of people to take advantage of its early success. Duke purchased the rights to a cigarette-making apparatus that was utilized in making many popular brands and enabled Duke to amass a considerable fortune. The genius of Duke was that he established patents on his cigarette-making machines throughout the world. Duke used part of their tobacco wealth to relocate Trinity College to Durham, which was later named Duke University. The other important cash crop during this time was cotton. And again, North Carolina's climate and ecology was perfect for growing this crop in abundance. Sharecroppers and tenant farmers were the main generators of cotton production. It was brutal, labor-intensive work that did not pay well. On the production side, cotton supported the development of cotton mills and mill towns like Carborough here in the Piedmont, and the mill worker. There were no child labor laws in the South, so if you were old enough to work, you worked in the local mill. As with tobacco production, cotton mills were connected via railroads to transport the raw material to factory towns. And as this map illustrates, North Carolina benefited from an incredible amount of these cotton mills in different parts of the state. At this sort of period of time, we had the passage of the Morrill Act, actually in 1862, which gave rise to land-grant colleges across the nation. And North Carolina State University was founded in 1887 with the goal of fulfilling that land-grant mission to educate farmers and engineers, which in turn helped support the growth of North Carolina's agricultural economy. And also during this period of time, North Carolina began to value its unique and rapidly disappearing natural heritage. And in 1915, established the first state park in the southeastern United States at Mount Mitchell, and I quote, "to conserve and protect representative examples of North Carolina's natural beauty, ecological features, recreation, and cultural resources." In the Triangle region, over time, an amalgamation of different protected resources were combined in 1966 to form the 5,000-acre William B. Umstead State Park, which some refer to today as the Triangle region's Central Park. In a similar manner, landscape museums in the form of arboretums and gardens were established across the Triangle region to preserve and showcase the unique ecology and biodiversity of the Piedmont region and other parts of North Carolina. Now, my final time frame that I want to talk about is from the 1960s to present. And this really focuses on the rapid growth and expansion of Triangle cities, their impact to native landscapes, and the response to this impact. And as Charles has done, I want to point out, that is the William Christmas Plan, and you can see how big Raleigh grew, and that's just a partial status of the growth plan. But even more important, I think, are these two maps. I was born in 1959. This is a snapshot of the southeastern United States in 1960. And in a 50-year period of time, this happened. Explosive growth across the South. We affectionately refer to this area right here as Charlantingham. It is the Piedmont Atlantic megaregion. It's one of the fastest growing megaregions in the world, and it is the fastest growing megaregion in the United States. Well, what happened? What gave rise? There are a lot of factors, too numerous for me to name. But one of the most important and underrated was the affordability of air conditioning. Air conditioning changed the American South, making it possible to grow white-collar jobs and support year-round living conditions that led to an expansion of the economy. In fact, the term air conditioning was coined in North Carolina. I believe with the advent of air conditioning, we had our first major separation, physical separation from the land and the ecology. We now lived in air-conditioned homes, we drove in air-conditioned cars, and eventually we farmed in air-conditioned tractor cabs. At the same time that that was happening, as Charles covered, in the 1950s, Governor Hodges and a group of educators based right here at North Carolina State University, and Romeo Guest and other business people came together and envisioned the creation of the Research Triangle Park. Now, what I'd like to talk about is the ecological reasons that this was so successful. Essentially, imagine that you're looking at your competition across North America, and the cities in the Northeast and in the Rust Belt states are polluted, they're crowded, and you're offering ample sunshine, fresh air. Come down, establish your research park among the pines. And the idea is lab coats and industrial research among the pines. Smell the wonderful aroma of the pines. That's essentially part of what they sold. I mean, it was really a couple of things. They sold the strength of the three universities, and they sold the ecology of place. They also, by the way, to Charles's point, the other thing they sold really hard was the ability to cater to the automobile travel. They sold those parking lots as an important part of why these industrial complexes should be located here. So as North Carolina's Piedmont landscape began to really explode and develop, we began to replace the family farm and the tobacco fields with residential subdivisions. Essentially, we traded agricultural fields for quarter-acre subdivisions. And we lost a lot of high-quality farmland in this period of time. But I think what's even more important to realize is the impact that all of this development had on the surrounding landscape. And I have to say, landscape architects were big contributors to the way in which growth and development happened, but they were also people that really were looking out for the impact associated with this development, as Charles pointed out. Land development pushed its way all across the Piedmont region, and it led to erosion of our native red clay soils and sedimentations of streams and rivers. It pushed into the very floodplains that the William Christmas Plan sought to avoid. And the most egregious of this was in the Triangle region was Crabtree Valley Mall, which opened in August of 1972, when one of Raleigh's signature creeks, the original creeks, Crabtree Valley Mall, was relocated. The mall flooded completely the very day before it was officially set to open. The pattern of suburban expansion and development was occurring at the same time that there was a wave of environmental regulations and interest, such as the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the National Environmental Policy Act. There was environmental activism, and there was the civil rights movement, and the visits of Dr. Martin Luther King to both NC State's campus and to Durham. What's fascinating to me that came out of this period was the leadership of Clarke and Flournoy. They both envisioned the creation of Raleigh's Greenway system. And this is the timeline that I was able to chase down. In 1967, found this article published in the Raleigh Times that quotes Lewis, "Then perhaps future generations can say that Raleigh citizens of the 60s thought wisely and acted intelligently to preserve the beauty and productivity of these capital city green fingers, so necessary to proper flood control and to man's use of the land." Now, this is 5 years before the opening of Crabtree Valley Mall. But in 1969, the city of Raleigh publishes this plan, the park with a city in it, and features this conceptual layout of a greenway system, essentially mirroring those floodplains. But then in 1972, Bill Flournoy authors his brilliant master's thesis, Capital City Greenway, which provides both the form and substance to the Greenway concept. And I think it's quite possibly the most important thesis to have ever been written and published in the College of Design. What's amazing to me is that you can pick up Bill's thesis today, give it to a community, and it has incredible relevance 46 years later. It's an incredible masterpiece. And the Capital Area Greenway system today serves the purpose that was originally envisioned by Clarke and Flournoy, protecting more than 4,000 acres of land, connecting important ecological systems together, keeping some people out of those floodable landscapes, and providing more than 120 miles of pathways that link people together. Which leads me to my closing thoughts. Much of North Carolina's cultural landscape has in fact been shaped and defined by her ecological framework. As we look to the future from an ecological point of view, it is becoming clear that we will live on a warmer planet with more severe and impactful weather patterns. The Triangle region alone will need to absorb another 1 million people. A question that I find very few people asking today is what becomes of our native ecology and environment in regard to that projected growth. For more than 400 years, we fished, hunted, timbered, farmed, and built our communities on this ecosystem. We've amassed fortunes and built thriving communities. What will be left of this ecological system for future generations to enjoy? And I'd like to point out, of the 100 North Carolina counties, only 2 are working from adopted open space plans. Durham and Wake, they both happen to be in the Triangle region. And I know this because I authored or helped author both of those plans. Our biosphere, where the majority of life exists today, is an extremely thin layer of planet Earth. I think it's an important fact that's not widely known or even discussed. Thus far, we know of no other zone of life anywhere in the universe that is equal to our biosphere. And yet we abuse it, degrade it, pollute it, and otherwise denigrate this critically important ecological construct of the planet. What I feel is desperately needed today is a robust conservation initiative to preserve and protect what remains of the Triangle and the Piedmont's unique natural heritage. Through our parks and greenways and other conservancy efforts during the past 40 years, we've built a solid foundation, but much more work must be accomplished. The Triangle region is going to continue to grow. There's no question of that. So it becomes a matter of how we grow and if our growth is balanced with conservation. North Carolina's unique ecology has provided a foundation for life and economic development for hundreds of years. It will take more thought and effort on our part to ensure that it continues to provide the same for future generations of Triangle residents. My hope is that landscape architects will assume a larger role in conservation, protection, and preservation of North Carolina's ecosystems, as we consider the resources and quality of life that will be available to our grandchildren and great-grandchildren.